The first test of Gorbachev's sincerity at trying to bring about better relationships between the East and the West was proven by the agreement for the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was all brought about because of the wider story of Star Wars. Strange as it might seem, mutually assured destruction had managed to keep the peace in the world since the end of World War II. Yet both sides, during the Cold War, had attempted to evolve new weapons that would give them advantages over the other side. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles are all examples of the Cold War encouraging this technological innovation. President Reagan's decision, however, to militarize outer space was a potential game-changer. In theory, it would render this idea of mutually assured destruction utterly irrelevant, with the United States able to intercept any Soviet first strike or retaliatory strike. Yet while this policy was proposed by the United States, improving relations continued between President Reagan and the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan pursued peace talks from a position of economic and military strength, whilst Gorbachev pursued reform at home by improving relations with the West and demonstrating his desire for peace. This in turn made Reagan look like the more aggressive of the two world leaders. Throughout this lesson, then, the purpose of your note-taking will be to identify the strengths and weaknesses of both sides around this time, around the mid to late 1980s. An example of the timetable that you might want to choose to set out is provided here, but make these notes as you go through this presentation. So, what did Gorbachev inherit when he took over? Well, during the Brezhnev era, huge amounts of money were spent trying to compete with the United States. Investment in the Soviet economy was low, leading to limited industrial growth in both Russia and Eastern Europe. As is the case throughout our entire story, Eastern Europe economically could not keep up with the West. Consequently, standards of living were plummeting, especially in comparison with countries in Western Europe, and the people in Eastern Europe, clever as they were, knew this. Years of poor leadership had additionally left the Soviet Union in chaos. Gorbachev was the first young leader of the Soviet Union in its history, and he had taken over after the leadership of three older previous leaders, neither of whom had been committed to anything like the degrees of reform that the Soviet Union needed. Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko had all failed to address or ignored the problems of the Soviet Union. In Eastern Europe, there had been unrest in Poland. People were complaining about poor human rights, poor living conditions. The trade union solidarity was becoming increasingly powerful in Poland. Control of other Eastern European countries was only made possible by the use of secret police forces. For example, in East Germany, the Stasi were becoming more powerful in an attempt to control the increasingly unhappy people. Gorbachev, when he came to power, said to his wife, "We can't go on living like this." Something had to be done. His new policies were perestroika, that was reconstructing the Soviet economy, and some of the practices that the West had. And secondly, glasnost, a policy of more openness, trying to remove corruption from the government and making the whole system of communism more democratic. People should not fear the state or expressing their own opinions. The domination of Eastern Europe against their will would be ended. The Soviet Union would no longer get involved in the internal affairs of other communist countries. He would withdraw from Afghanistan, and most importantly, he would reduce spending on arms and defence so he could spend on making people happier. Of course, in order to reduce spending on arms, he would need to be friendlier with the West. There was also, of course, change in the United States. Reagan began his term in office saying he would stand tough against communism, and even brought about a second Cold War with Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko by spending more money on weapons and defence. But when Gorbachev became leader, Reagan saw a real opportunity to end the Cold War. He was a man who ultimately wanted peace, and Gorbachev wanted that too. they were able to work together. They would meet at two separate locations, Geneva in Switzerland in November 1985 and Reykjavik in Iceland in October 1986. At the Geneva summit, there were no formal agreements, but Reagan and Gorbachev established good working relationships with each other and a mutual desire to improve relations between their countries. At the Reykjavik summit in 1986, Gorbachev was worried about the danger that nuclear weapons posed to the world. His desire to reduce the world's stockpile of nuclear weapons may well have been strengthened when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Russia exploded in 1986. Large swathes of the Soviet Union and beyond were affected by nuclear fallout from this. At Reykjavik, Gorbachev proposed the phasing out of nuclear weapons if the Americans were prepared to give up their Star Wars program. The outcome was that both leaders knew that the Americans could not agree to give up Star Wars. Once again, the meeting broke up with no formal agreement, but improvement in relations continued. When they met in Washington in December 1987, Gorbachev had now accepted that the Americans were not going to scrap the Star Wars program, and that his country's best interests lay in agreements on disarmament and reducing spending on weapons and better relations with the West. This was the first Soviet-American summit that led to the signing of a formal treaty. This was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. Both countries said they would get rid of all land-based missiles with a range of 500 to 5,000 kilometer range. In 1988, at this summit, there was some detail to be resolved, but Gorbachev then later travelled to the United States, where he made a speech to the United Nations announcing a reduction in Warsaw Pact troops and that the Soviet Union would leave Afghanistan. All of these summits led to improving relations. Here are the two leaders signing the INF Treaty. An entire range of nuclear missiles would be destroyed. In 1989, in Malta, Gorbachev met with the new American President, George Bush. No new agreements were made, but both the USA and the Soviet Union saw this meeting as marking the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev said, "I assure the President of the United States that I will never start a hot war against the USA. We are at the beginning of a long road to a lasting peaceful era. The threat of force, mistrust, psychological and ideological struggle should be all things of the past. We can realize a lasting peace and transform the East-West relationship to one of enduring cooperation." All of this will have a consequence on Eastern Europe. Gorbachev had announced the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine. All satellite states were free to choose their own governments, and they would no longer have to fear Soviet intervention, like Hungary and Czechoslovakia did in 1956 and 1968. All satellite states were encouraged in this period of glasnost to introduce changes that would improve their standard of living and freedoms. A key event was Hungary's decision to open its border with Austria, creating a hole in the buffer zone in the Iron Curtain. Gorbachev removed his troops from Hungary and didn't interfere. Gorbachev had intended to end communism, but introduced reforms that would strengthen the communist governments within the satellite states in the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union. However, within 12 months of his speech, the communist system would be dismantled throughout Eastern Europe, and 1 year after that, the Soviet Union itself fell apart. The impact on each of the countries. The fall of the Berlin Wall. And the end of the Warsaw Pact.